Chapter 19. The Manifesto of a Monster. The instructor was woken by a loud series of noises and rolled his eyes. He gathered his trident reflexively as well as his body armor and made his way through the halls to their source. The sunrise made the lights of the gym stand out slightly less, but nonetheless still noteworthy given that all the other rooms were still dark. He was familiar enough with Havalia's morning routine, but didn't recall her causing such an uproar before. "I thought I told that girl that powerlifting wouldn't help stamina," he grumbled, as he reached for his scroll. A loud shake drew the attention of the other kids in the dorm, sounded that suddenly narrowed his vision. He moved to use the device to open the door and saw it had already opened. He let out a modest yell to draw her attention. "Girl, what is going on? Did you sneak in the game again?" he noted jokingly and made his way to the entrance and into where the noises were coming from. He slowed and eventually came to a full stop when he heard the other voice. He broke into a full sprint and rushed the doors open to find them in the middle of their sparring session. Gideon's eyes had glazed over, but not gone full black yet. His swings rippled the air with full purpose to kill, but Havalia ducked and rolled to avoid each one. The ground had been furrowed and cracked in various places where stray swings had fallen, and his speed had almost been matched. It was the almost that terrified him, and realized his presence would only put her at risk. She noticed and broke her purposeful contact with Gideon's eyes while rolling to distance herself from him. He let out one final swing that embedded itself into the concrete and suddenly weighed him down. The cloud cleared from his eyes, and his consciousness returned to him almost immediately. They both looked at the door, and the instructor emerged. She began to take steps to explain, but Gideon stepped forward first and raised his voice. "Sir, I couldn't sleep. She took the time to make sure I was still a part of the team." His glare held for another few moments before moving his gaze to her. She didn't say anything and didn't know how to respond. If it was anyone else, she would have been insulted by the gesture made in her defense. Yet a part of her appreciated his willingness to stand in her place even if it wasn't necessary. A small crowd started to gather behind him, and he realized a lecture would accomplish less in this situation than what would be ideal. All right. It may not have been the alarm you were all told to set, but let's make our way to the classroom. You will have presentations to make." It didn't matter if the majority of them were adults. Groaning remained the only appropriate response to a test. Gideon finally let his shoulders fall and began following the crowd. He stopped for a moment to see Havalia looking at him. "You joining us, Leia?" She nodded after gathering a flurry of thoughts together. "That'd be a good idea. I did your reading after all." He smiled briefly and continued. Daniel and Olivia were waking up on their own, but would be joining them shortly. "Well, we ought to hurry." This made Havalia look to the ground again. "Right. Ought." The class gathered quickly, and the shuffling of papers was filling up the empty space in each group. The various teams formed never held to the traditions of the other schools. Where each team normally had a leader, the position was filled by whoever was willing and able at the time. This applied as much on the field as in their studies. Each representative approached the instructor with their essays, and he received them all personally. Eye contact was made with every one of them who didn't meet his gaze. All but one. Havalia handed him their papers and took a moment before returning to her seat. He blinked and then solemnly brought his head to meet his students. "I'm sure you are all familiar with these formalities at this point and would rather be in the field. Frankly, so would I. However, apart from the few of you called to address this new problem in gathering physical evidence of their location, we are more concerned by preventing future recruits to this tribe of bandits. Would anyone like to ask questions before your verbal exams begin?" The students eyed one another in their own ways. Some were cautious, others curious. A select few didn't break eye contact with him. Gideon simply held his sword behind him as an observer alongside the other huntsman called to scout. "Very well. Will Team Royal first give their presentation, and I will be looking at your reports while you give it." The tension rose as each tried to learn from the other exactly where the flaws in this terrorist group's ideology could be found. Red stepped forward and began to speak. "Our reports on the writings of their bandit chief will focus mainly on his upbringing, why he shouldn't be considered the type of person to lead groups of people. The class listened in silence as they all had the story retold to them that they all had read before. Abimelech, the messenger of the mountain, was raised in a way the majority of the class was unfamiliar with. He had parents and grew up in relative safety. Before the days of the Great War and the events that shaped all of their lives into that of a soldier's by necessity, he lived in the very oasis their city was built on. He himself gave no reason for anything worth complaining about. He never wondered where his next meal came from. He never doubted his parents' love for him. He simply never accepted it. The day he discovered his semblance gave him the opportunity to bring his fantasies to life. He could control the Grimm. One day, when his temper flared high, he drew the Grimm into his home to slaughter his entire family. He was taken to the mountains and never had any desire to return. Months of isolation eventually drove him mad, and he called on the Grimm once more. The beasts took him to their master, where he was offered a choice. While the origins and identity of this individual is unknown, his reports tell of a woman with the power to offer true freedom. His acceptance of her offer came at a price. In order to become a king, he was made her slave, and he reveled in it. He was given powers and voice to rally every self-serving mind and soul in all four kingdoms. With the power of an army behind them, he led a full-scale crusade against those who wouldn't march under his banner. Disunity within the ranks eventually split the army from within and drove them all into hiding, leaving their king wounded and without an army. He now waits for the orders from his queen, the day he refers to as the Second March on the Gods. The instructor, along with the students, not pretending to take notes on each presentation, attempting to clarify or contribute to each of their points. All of them essentially said the same thing, but varied on where he started. This man killed his parents because he didn't get the food he wanted, and we're going to make this man the arbiter of society to lead humanity to a bright and better future? After months in isolation and showing signs of post-traumatic stress, he more than likely had a starved dream that affirmed his actions in an attempt to cope with them. Due to the nature of his behavior while handling power, he more than likely was telling the truth in how he attained it. He wouldn't have lied about someone that gave him power and then continued that lie in failing it. Whoever gave him this power, we can't be certain. All that we know is that the Grimm brought him somewhere and it changed him. They may have even made him one of them. Discrepancies in his account show a number of inconsistencies in major details. Armies dying before battles had taken place. Insurrection within their ranks appears before and after they rose to power. His claims of the gods cursing their queen as somehow a means of giving her power. Dust and magic used interchangeably, and others begged the question of his ability to record honest history. More than likely, he was an upstart all his own and wrote this section as propaganda to build himself back to glory, where it was never truly had in the first place. And my favorite, what this man has done and plans to do is evil. Havilah read off from her notes with indifference before beginning her own speech. Daniel and Olivia watched uneasily as she set down the papers and picked up her own. My report, and that of my team, is simply this. He is not wrong. A moment of dead silence filled the room before she continued. Though sporadic, the human race has records of a time before the faunus and a time of magic, a time where the gods walked the earth and the world as we knew it functioned quite differently. Briefly raising her voice, and no, I did not find it hidden in the fiction section of the library. A better future to be led into means that we have an idea of how things ought to be, and that we are indeed getting closer to it. A mental disorder implies a solid definition of what a sound mind ought to be. To be not a Grimm means that there is some distinction between them and him that was removed. Discrepancies in history are only flaws if we have evidence that something contrary to them actually took place and from more reliable sources. Something being evil requires a definition of good. She placed down her papers and then began her presentation. My proposal in dealing with these bandits is none. I and my team were the ones who faced them directly and saw what they are capable of. Everything they are is the opposite of what we hope and expect from each other as decent living beings. And while our society is right to us, their behavior is the same to them for the exact same reasons. Theology is the most important topic because it bears the most implications. The God of our world, the greatest possible being, is the standard through which we judge that good, the ideal, truth. Our world has two gods, therefore two separate ideals, one of creation that we enjoy, one of destruction, which they have chosen. All of the reports before ours avoided this topic, and I would have expected nothing less. Without thought of the gods, we may have been able to come up with our own morals and become our own gods. Yet the standards of the Creator have applied to us because of who He is by nature. Now the disciples of the Destroyer have shown the nature of the alternative, and with that choice available to them, we have now seen all of our options. What is the solution? Present both in the most honest light possible, and let those who are making their choices do so informed with results. There is no way I can claim, however, that what they are doing is wrong, not without throwing away the same reasons we desire to live in peace. Without another word, she joined her team and sat down. The silence lingered, save for the instructor, who seemed unfazed by the gravity of her words. He scratched a few last notes on his paper and stood to his feet. After a quick glance around the room, he dismissed the class without another word. "You all may go. Thank you for your reports." No one moved. "Is there something wrong?" he queried, slowly taking his seat. Some of the students stood to their feet and pointed accusing fingers at them, condemnations varying for calls for their arrest as converts to falling short of the report standard by failing to debunk them. He remained stone-faced as he heard all of their complaints. A full minute of noise resounded through the halls until they saw their words weren't finding purchase. This began to horrify the students, thinking that he had been converted to a terrorist as well. The moment he read that fear in their eyes, he got to his feet and walked over to the board. With 3 taps of his finger, he drew their attention to the very purpose of their assignment. He repeated them for emphasis. "From their source. Prove them wrong. Provide..." A pause was made, as a shadow of a doubt betrayed his voice. "Evidence. This is not something exclusive to our borders. We are bringing all of your reports as suggestions to Beacon in dealing with these matters in the future. Your assignment was to show from their own words why they are wrong. Now you accuse your classmates of treason when they were closer to the enemy we face than any of you. Show me from her words where she was wrong." No one said a word. Ideas formed in their minds out of obligation, but they had learned too much to voice them. "This is our reality, students. Some of you suggested dismissal, others the confrontation of their founder. Team Gold simply proposed consistency and transparency. All will be addressed by the headmaster. That is all for today." Those last words were spoken with an emphasis that they all knew well, and they began to leave. They all heard each other's positions and knew the same texts. Now they looked at each other with an emptiness that they had never known. They now found no distinction between their enemies and themselves. A few glanced at tomorrow's schedule out of habit more than anything else. Daniel laughed to himself, drawing the attention of those around him. "What is it?" Olivia asked quietly. He gestured towards the paper hanging outside the classroom. "Axiology already got cancelled." She squinted briefly before wondering where the relevance to their situation was. Havaliah and Gideon remained silent. "The study of ethics? Why?" Those around them shook their heads. "Why indeed?" Daniel rumbled somberly. "Why indeed?"